Gridding is a useful skill for artists. It's a prime method of taking a reference photo on a smaller scale and transferring it to a larger space, or a completely blank one, like for a painting on a canvas or a drawing on a piece of paper. For our purposes, we're going to be watercoloring with the images that you've turned into Shobi, but again, the tricky part is freehanding it. Gridding takes a lot of the guesswork out of freehanding a reference photo. The skull on the left has a white grid laid over it, while the grid on the right is a black grid with nothing in it. Each square in the skull picture coordinates to a square in the blank section on the right, and all you have to do is essentially kind of paint by numbers. You have to look at the shapes in each square and where certain lines and contours run into the edges of each square in the grid in order to properly proportion these objects. The grid gives you a better, more solid sense of scale for the project that you're transferring, and it allows for some freedom. By breaking the picture down into a series of squares, you stop thinking about it as a whole image, and rather just a collection of lines and shapes that happen to run into the lines of your grid. All you have to worry about is where those lines run into the grid. You can gauge things by how close they are to the halfway point between two corners, or how close something runs into a corner, if it runs into a corner at all, if it curves halfway through the box and comes back around. Every placement of every shape and line influences your scale. It almost blinds you to the total image, so you can focus on actual details of the picture rather than the whole thing. The smaller the grid, the more accurate your drawing will be. The larger the squares, the more you have to fill in and kind of guess at. So it depends on your picture and it depends on your grid. But each of you in this next watercolor project will be working from the same grid with the same proportions on the same sized watercolor paper. So that takes some of the guesswork out of it at least. Your first assignment in this unit is to do this skull worksheet. I want to see outlines, I don't really want to see shading because that's not really why we're here. And a brief disclaimer, I am using a 2H pencil for everything in this video so you can see it a little better. But you should be using a 6H pencil for all of this. The lighter sketch you have, the better your drawing will be. And especially when you draw your grid, you really need to use a 6H pencil because any grid that you draw will need to be erased eventually. Always bear that in mind. Now, knowing how to have your photo gridded is a key point in this, and this is the one that I'll be using for this example. It's just a bunch of peaches. As you can see, I have 8 squares edge to edge on the bottom and 6 squares on the side. Depending on the orientation of your photo, that might be reversed. You might have 8 squares on the side and 6 on the bottom, but either way, you will always have a small space on one side of this. This is important. We can trim that off later, but it has to be in your grid for now. We'll talk about it in a bit. Now, how to make your own grid. I said that we had 6 squares on the right and 8 squares on the bottom. This is a 10 by 13 inch page. So if we take 13 divided by 8 squares, we get 1.625, or 1 5/8. And that is this marking on your ruler. You can pause the video and double check it if you want, and you can use pencil on your ruler should you choose to. But reading a ruler can be difficult. As you can see, we have 0.25 or 2/8, 4/8 or 0.5, and 6/8 or 0.75. That coordinates to 1/4, 1/2, and 3/4. But we want right in between the 1/2 and 3/4 mark for that 5/8 mark right there, because 5 divided by 8 is 0.625. Now, for making your own grid, you're going to start from the left and measure one space at a time, moving your ruler each time. This is so important. Don't try to just set your ruler down once and eyeball the rest of it. Nope, you want to measure it space by space. And then when you move to the top, start measuring from the left again. Do not flip your paper. Do not. Don't do it. If you do, your measurements will be off. If you start measuring from the left on the bottom, you measure from the left on the top. If you measure from the right on the bottom, measure from the right on the top. Don't do it opposite ways. But once you have both of those markings at the top and bottom of your page, you are just going to lightly connect those lines. And like I said, I'm using a 2H pencil so you can see this in the video. Please use a 6H for this. And then you're going to repeat the process on the sides of the page, and you should have 6 spaces. And again, moving down to the bottom, measuring from the left again, and moving over inch by inch here, or metaphorically speaking. And that is going to be our little space up at the top that I mentioned earlier. You have to have that. If you didn't have that, you would have rectangles and not squares. And a good rule of thumb is that if your gridded page is covered in rectangles instead of perfect squares, then you have done something horribly wrong. And then it just comes down to filling in each square. You can look at the individual squares as a whole, but I like to think of long lines. Like I'm going to start with the left side of this front peach and try to connect it through this section, just 2 squares at a time, thinking about how the curve leads up into the next one and where that next curve is going to go. And I know that the top part of the peach is going to miss that corner and kind of shave it off in like a triangle up there. And then the top curve of the peach is going to meet that halfway point and curve around to the right before it dips back in toward the stem. The pictures that you've turned into Shobi are all different orientations, different sizes. Some have more negative space than others, but all of you will be working from a 10 by 13 page. So when I grid it, I will use my best judgment to try to crop it as needed in order to fit the space. You might lose some edges, but I will try to maintain your focal point and a good composition. The best way to do this, really, is to work at it maybe a square or 2 at a time. Draw a line, figure out where it runs into the edges of your square, and then make sure that it connects to the next line in the next square properly, and then it leads into the next line and the line after that. A common problem with gridding is that people get too focused on the individual squares and their lines don't flow through the page as they should. They almost look blocky and like curves don't continue the way they should. Try not to let that happen to you. Your lines should flow and should connect through the spaces. Don't make them bumpy, don't make them jagged. Like I said earlier, the grid is something you will erase later. So please draw it lightly in the first place, and then when you are done, erase around it. And then when you are done, you will have to erase very carefully as not to damage your paper. If you have drawn your grid very hard, you're done. You won't be able to do anything with that page. That grid will always be visible. So make sure that you draw it lightly and take care. You're only going for the basic shape. The less you have drawn, honestly, the better. Watercolor shows everything. Be prudent with what you draw, and be careful. Good luck.